Hey everybody, it's Tommy Canale and welcome to Before the Lights podcast, the show to find out how those in sports, music, and entertainment made their mark. Today, he was involved in all facets of gambling and the hospitality business. He's a publisher and was an adjunct professor at UNLV. He's an author of the book, Las Vegas Dunes Hotel, The Mob, The Connections, The Stories. He has worked at several casinos that include Sahara, California Club, Dunes, Flamingo, Imperial Palace, and he owned Cowboy Casino. He's the president of Houdini's Magic and has years of experience in casino operations, scams, and cheaters. Please welcome to the show, Geno Munari. Geno, how are you, my friend?
Hi, Tommy. Thanks for inviting me on your show.
I am thrilled to have you here. You grew up in Burbank, California. I understand you had a fascination of magic that began at 12 years old. What started the fascination with magic?
Well, I was a pretty active kid. You know, I swam and rode my bike everywhere. And one day I went to a local park and I was on the monkey bars and I slipped, fell backwards, and I broke my right leg. And so I was in a cast for like a couple of months. So I had to stay home, and my dad brought me a trick. And that started it off.
And if you would tell our listeners your relationship and who was Jimmy Grippo?
Jimmy Grippo was one of the greatest magicians. He's also a hypnotist, and he was also a manager and owner of a professional fighter, Emilio Bettina. And then his last years, he worked as an executive magician in residence at Caesar's Palace for over 25 years. Before that, he was at the Desert Inn, and he had to get permission to leave the Desert Inn to go to Caesar's, by the way.
And Geno, how does magic, and if it does, closely relate to gambling?
Well, let me just say a little word about Jimmy. Jimmy was like my idol as far as the magicians I've ever seen. Been on the Carson show, I think, 3 times. You watched him perform, you didn't want to watch any other magicians. That was my opinion anyway. And it is close because sleight of hand and card cheating and cards and playing cards. You use many of the moves in magic that you would use on the gaming table. In other words, a false shuffle, a false cut, that sort of thing, Tom.
You moved to Las Vegas in 1964. Was your first job in the casino industry at the Sahara in the dealer's room serving coffee then?
I was a busboy in the dealer's. Well, I was not in the dealer's room right away. I worked in the summer, in a coffee shop, and then an opening came up, and the hostess says, "We need a guy back there. You want to work there? It's a late shift." I said, "That's okay with me." So they put me to work from 11 to 7, 11 at night till 7 in the morning, the graveyard shift they called it. And I don't think I ever had a break. By the way, I worked the entire shift. The dealers came in every 20 minutes, got a cup of coffee or a meal, and they left. This went on all night. And they certainly were an effect on my personality and my like of gaming. They told stories, and I listened. I listened with my eyes wide open, kept my mouth shut. I just thought it was fun.
So that job there in the dealer's room, kind of what opened your eyes and gave you the so-called bug to get into the gaming industry.
Yeah, I actually I wanted to get into aviation, and I tried to join the warrant officer program of the Army. I went down to Los Angeles with 40 other guys, and I passed everything but the eye physical, and I couldn't get into the program. So I thought the next alternative would be the gambling business. Those guys were doing pretty good, and they lived pretty good, and I liked their style. Whole different style than it was today. Whole different style.
I'll bet. You started at the Dunes at 22 years old, did really what I would call a very short stint at Skyline, and then went back to the Dunes. And at one time had Cowboy Casino, which was the drugstore tavern in downtown Henderson. We're going to get into the book, but where I'd like to start, Geno, is can you explain baccarat to my listeners and what type of game and who plays that game?
Okay. Baccarat, it's a simple game. There's basically 2 main bets, but there's also a third proposition bet, like a bet on a tie hand, for instance. But just think of it as 2 sides, the black side or the red side, or the Yankees or the Mets. Just think of two different sides. You bet on one side or the other. There's a person who deals cards. The person who deals the cards gets the shoe. He doesn't have to bet on the bank. He can bet on the players if he wants. There's two places to bet: banker's side and player's side. Two cards are dealt out, two for the players, two for the bank. After turning the cards over, depending on what the total of the two cards are, and the other hand as well, you draw or you stand and the hand's over with. And the drawing of extra cards is determined by what card comes out as the player's first card. The bank will either stand or take another card. That's all played by rules. I don't want to get into the technical part of the rules, but
sure, the
dealers tell you exactly when to draw and when to stand. It's pretty simple. It's basically just two sides to bet on, banker, players, and it really attracts a lot of big rollers because the limits are high. At those days at the Dunes, we had 2,000 and 4,000. Then if you tied, you could double your bet, and certain players could bet as much as they wanted. But normal people, in other words, when I was a young kid, 22, you didn't have young people my age play the game for the most part. It usually was people who were big players, who had some cash, who had some money to gamble with. And mostly the junket players played, and some of the wealthy Asians and so forth. It wasn't like a person who played a nickel slot machine would come over and play baccarat. Half of the people would just look at it and still not understand it.
And I appreciate you explaining that, because it's going to come back more into the story as we go. We're going to jump into the Dunes. The Dunes opened in 1955, closed on January 26, 1993, and it was imploded on October 27th, 1993. The Dunes really got off to a tough beginning. Geno, was the first topless show in Las Vegas by the name of Minsky what really started to turn the tide, so to speak, for the Dunes?
Well, yeah, they tried all kinds of things, and they had a great couple of owners there, by the way. One guy was Bill Miller, who owned the club off of over the bridge from the Manhattan. He had Bill Miller's Riviera. But he was a great guy. He was a real promoter, and he went to work for the Sahara, and even went to work for the International. But Minsky, who they brought in, it did bring some players, and they also brought junkets up from the LA area. And at that time, Kirk Kerkorian, the multimillionaire who passed away a couple of years ago, he was actually a small point holder in the Dunes at that time. I think it had something to do with aviation or flying. But yeah, it was one of the first topless shows. In fact, they had some problems, with the local churches, and the Dunes didn't back down, and they continued having the shows. They were very successful.
What did Sid Wyman mean to the Dunes?
Sid Wyman was, and I'll just tell you this kind of a code word we had for him. When I was dealing blackjack for a short time at the Dunes, we had many Cuban dealers that came from Cuba through the relations of some of the operators of the Dunes. And the Cubans had a code for if a boss came by, be on your best behavior. Paco. You heard a dealer on the next table say Paco, P-A-C-O, be careful. But if you heard the word Pacon, Legrand, that means Sid Wyman was coming down the aisle. And one day I heard that, and he came up to he went to the table next to me. He turned his back to the table, and he leaned against it, and he was talking to the dealer. They weren't face to face, but he was talking to the dealer. And he came to my table, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what's he want, And he said, Geno, I want you to do me a favor. I said, yes, sir, Mr. Wyman. I want you to vote for Laxalt. And he walked away. And that was it. Governor Laxalt was considered running for governor again at the time.
Right.
And he didn't go through with it, though, that particular time. The biggest shareholder, his group was the biggest shareholder in the Dunes Hotel. Also, he was the biggest shareholder under Gus Greenbaum, the second biggest shareholder at the Riviera Hotel.
In your opinion, Geno, why wasn't Sid Wyman brought into the Terre Haute bankruptcy operations, and was he involved in it?
I would have to say yes. I would have to say yes, and I'm certainly not, revealing any secrets here.
Right.
He was a great guy. He was nice to me. He was a tough guy, but he was nice to me. He had a front, and his front was one of his buddies for years and years, and he had several buddies there. And that was the guy that eventually was the baccarat manager at the Dunes Hotel, Irwin Gordon. Irwin Gordon took the rap, I believe, for him and a few other guys.
Casino manager, stockholder, president, and board member, George Duckworth. Explain who he was to you and his importance to the Dunes.
Well, I met George at the airport when I was a young kid, flying. I was a flight instructor, actually. I met him before I was a flight instructor. When I was 19, I became a flight instructor. And, I used to go out to the airport and hang out, and George was in a little coffee shop they had there with a couple of tables, and he'd always be out telling stories. I just listened in delight. And, I didn't know much about him or what he did. I knew he worked at Dunes. That was about it. But he was Charles Cupie Rich, who was Sid Wyman's partner from the early days in booking in St. Louis. They were the biggest commission house in the country. They take action on anything. And they used Western Union to solicit their agents to solicit business for them. And he gave the union agents commissions for every bet they brought in. George was Cupie's stepson. And he took care of him. He married George's mother, and her name was Evelyn. She was a wonderful lady. I remember her very well. And, he trusted George, and he took George with him to Las Vegas, and they worked in the Royal Vegas. They worked in the Riviera, and, of course, then they bought into the Dunes. Casino manager, and I never forget, I went to go get a job. I got done working downtown. I broke in downtown, and I wanted to get a little more money, so we're making maybe $10 a day in tokes. That was about it, tips, that is. And so I went out to the Flamingo. I had a few friends out there, and I walked up to the shift manager and asked him for an audition, and he put me on the table, and I could deal fairly well. I mean, I really was confident. And he said, okay, took me off, and he says, you're not ready yet. So I said, oh, wow. Anyway, I looked across the street. I saw the Dune sign. I said, oh, I remember George. Maybe he'll give me an audition. I went over there, gave me an audition, and he hired me right on the spot. And, maybe I dealt for 6 months. This was 1968. I dealt for about 6-7 months in the 21. And, I was learning to deal baccarat at home with a couple of friends of mine. We had a table we built. And said, I'm going to ask him if I can go over there and practice for free. We watched the owners, Tommy, what kind of mood they were in, They were smiling and laughing. We knew good time to talk to them. If they weren't smiling and talking, we stayed away from them, So I saw him. He was kind of like in a good mood. And I'm going to tell you, I don't know how I had the guts to do it, but I walked up to him. I said, Mr. Duckworth, I just want to ask you something, if I may. I'm learning baccarat, and I was wondering if I can go over there in my own time sometime, maybe for an hour or two, and get some practice. He says, get yourself 2 tuxedos. You're hired. You start tomorrow night. I said, wait. I said, no, I don't. And he walked away from me. He basically hired me. I didn't even know the game. They put me on the game, and so I owe him $1 million for that. So
years later, you wrote him a letter that he never answered about him actually writing a book. And he had stated that there was 2 people holding him from writing.
Somebody in his family, a relative of his nephew, who was a close friend of mine as well. I taught his nephew how to deal baccarat, by the way. And he was an airline captain with United Airlines. And so his nephew said one day we were at lunch, George and I and a couple of others, and I asked George, hey, George, why don't you write a book about the Dunes? And he said, George said this, I have to wait till 2 people pass away before I do that. So that was kind of a mystery. I always wondered who those 2 people were.
Do you have any opinion who they might be?
And I think I put them in the book, but could be a lot of different people. But I believe he was in a precarious position there at the Dunes Hotel. It was a really interesting situation.
Your book Las Vegas Dunes Hotel, The Mob, The Connections, The Stories will be out in September. But if George would have responded to your letter, how would your story have changed?
Well, if George would have responded, and I found out why he didn't respond, by the way, the family, his immediate family that was caretaking him, he had 2 daughters and a son. I guess the one daughter, I'm not going to mention names, and the other daughter and son had a difference in how George was being managed. And George was getting older. Now, you got to understand he was getting up until his 90s. And, he had some rough luck and he had some illness, but he was a strong guy. He never got the letter, I was told by his son. His daughter didn't give it to him. And I was so disappointed. But if he'd have got my letter, I talked to George about things before, though. I used to call him on the phone and ask him some questions, and he was pretty open. But I really didn't want to push him, and I know I can probably kick myself in my rear for this. I should have insisted that we met more often. But he told me things, and I think he would have. I would have gotten him to concede to write more stuff, and with the condition that maybe it was only used until after he died. I think that would have happened, and I believe, Tommy, that these former owners, and all, not just the Dunes, but in many stories that we read on the mafia history and on Facebook that's there. I believe those guys probably detest the fact that other people claim some of the feats and things that happen, like the wannabes. I'm going to tell you this. I really don't even believe today that the true story of Las Vegas has really ever been completely told. There's more to it. And I think I relate to that a little bit in the book by a certain person who told me some things. And I have some documentary evidence that probably confirms it. And I don't think it's even mentioned anywhere, even in the Mob Museum. I don't even think they're aware of it. So that's another thing I'm thinking about for the future. But I think George would have said, "Look, we did this and we did that." I don't think he would have said we did this wrong, but he would have told me a little more about the operation. But I'll tell you this one time, when I got promoted to a floor man, and it wasn't because I knew George. It was one of the floor men in the baccarat promoted me because I knew the game. That was all I knew. I mean, that was my best game. And I actually used to have to watch both sides of the table sometimes because the other floor man was not capable of handling it. He was always distracted and so forth. And one time I had this idea. I used to drive down Flamingo Road every single day and stop at the stoplight at the Strip. The Dunes was across the street. On my right was a little motel called the Desert Villa Motel. Mm-hmm. And I said, wow. I was looking at waiting for the signal to change, and I used to think, what a great place for a mini casino right there. They've got 100 rooms. You could build a little slot joint and so forth. So I think I want to talk to George about it. Maybe he'll like it. Maybe he won't. So I approached him about it. He said, I like that. Let's go over there. So following day or so, he brought Artie Solman, another official of the Dunes, and myself. We went over there and talked to the owner, still empty. And I had talked to empty before, and I pretty much prepared George for the price and so forth. And so we talked it over, and they liked it. As we walked back, I'll never forget George telling me, "Yeah, we'll go get a Teamster loan, and we will build that place." So he says, "Go back and final this up with him if you can." I went back to Empty, and I said, "No, Phil, the price we talked about was $2 million. Now, this corner is where the Barbary Coast was, and now the Cromwell, okay? Mm-hmm. So, Cromwell Hotel. So I talked to Phil, and Phil says, well, I want $2.1 million. He raised it $100,000. So I went back and told George, and George says, screw him. I don't want no part of it. That $100,000, he felt that he surprised them at the end, knowing that he had a sale, and they backed away. Now, whether that was the final reason, I don't know. It might have been other reasons that I'm not even aware of. Competitive reasons from maybe some silent partners that might be around. I don't know. But that would have been a great deal for me. By the way, when it was finally sold by the Boyd Corporation, the Barbary Coast, I think the sales price was $850 million, something like that. I know. 2.1 million is all they wanted.
Geno, what was Sid Wyman's relationship with Meyer Lansky and the ties to the Thunderbird and the Dunes?
Well, that's an interesting proposition. Sid was nice to me. I think there was an alleged memo, Western Union telegram that was sent to him from the Flamingo that's been circulating on the internet. I don't know if it's real. I got a lot of doubts about it.
I have it as well.
Yeah. But I do have a newspaper article where Wyman is indicated as being a partner in one of Lansky's casinos in Havana. That is right in the black and white on one of my footnotes. I believe you can find that. And then I'll never forget this. So one day I had lunch with George Duckworth. We met out at the airport. This was probably in the neighborhood of 2003, 4, something in that time frame.
Okay. And
we were just talking and shooting the breeze. I wasn't writing the book then. I just was interested in all this. And George came out and said, after my father died and Wyman died, they settled the estates. We found some papers that looked like Wyman made a deal and went around my dad. And instead of buying the Thunderbird as they were going to do, then they went into the Dunes. The nephew of Duckworth states that he believes that Wyman was given some front money. But, Wyman was a player. So, players who have a problem need money. There's no telling what they're due. But in his mind, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He probably thought it was a better deal. That's my justification of it. But Wyman had power. And how he had the power, he had the most stock. And one of the original Dunes owners, when they took over in 62 or 63 that year, was Cupie, George, Wyman, and a few other owners, Howie Engel and Bob Rice and so forth. And they had a guy by the name of Wendell Fletcher, who was a popular, very famous aviation industrialist, had several patents, aviation patents and so forth, had plenty of cash. A friend of Sid's and George's by the name of Todd Durlachter, who was an employee of the Dunes in some capacity, and I remember seeing him almost every other day, he arranged for Wendell Fletcher to invest in the Dunes when they opened it. And it was quite a bit of money. They needed that money to really complete the bankroll requirements and so forth. And so they made the deal. Gottlieb was the landlord, and Wendell, bought in. A year or so or later, I don't know exactly the time frame, Wendell got in trouble on sexual charges with a younger lady under the age of 21 or 18. And he had to give his license up, so he sold it. Sid Wyman acquired his shares. That gave him controlling interest of the Dunes.
And you're talking about Jake Gottlieb, who was tied to the Chicago outfit. While we're on Jake Gottlieb, what was his relationship with Jimmy Hoffa?
Well, I found an article in a newspaper where Jimmy Hoffa, in his own words, says the Gottlieb brothers, which was John Gottlieb in Los Angeles, who I met him, by the way, as well, and Jake Gottlieb, they were one of my first customers in the Teamsters. And Jake had a company called Western Trucking Company, and they were in Chicago. And, I think I lead on to some of the people that Jake was friendly with in Chicago. And there's no doubt that the mob had a chance to, or could have very well, the Chicago mob could have got involved with, the Dunes in those days, especially of the surveillance I have of Giancana and Wyman, where Wyman was basically talking to a friend of Giancana's, Patsy Pearl, about investing in the dunes. And so there's other Chicago guys that also allegedly had a piece of the dunes as well. And I think I touched that in the book. Gus Alex, and I even think Licavoli was involved.
Mm-hmm.
Licavoli was probably involved through Gottlieb somehow, and a few other guys in Detroit. But that's about the way I read it anyway.
It was said that Tony Spilotro operated from the poker room at the dunes. What did you witness about Spilotro, his actions, demeanor, stuff like that?
Well, he had a crew, but he hung around the poker room, and there was a couple of guys that were a couple of thieves that, they moved on people holding out. I mean, secretly moving cards in and out. And they also played top hand, meaning there's three of them against one of you. But he had guys that Spilotro might bankroll that would play Riddle, Wyman, and even Duckworth at times. But that didn't last long. They were warned about him, and he didn't hang around there very much. And just for your knowledge, Spilotro couldn't go in the MGM Grand as well. He wasn't allowed in there. And why? The higher-ups talked to somebody, and he stayed out of there. I saw him many times. My wife was a cocktail waitress there. She said he was very courteous, never caused any trouble. When I leave the poker room used to be next to the entrance to the coffee shop, and the baccarat, and that was right in front of the showroom. And on the other side of the aisle was the baccarat. So when I left baccarat for a break to the coffee shop, you'd always see him, and sometimes he'd look at you and stare at you, but never gave me any trouble. That never bothered me. However, there's many stories about what he really was in town and what he wasn't. But I don't believe he told the dunes owners what to do. I believe he was allowed to make a little money for a while because of the dunes connections with Chicago. But I think the heat of gaining control and so forth got him banned out of the place.
Before we go on with more interview with Geno, I want to tell you about Aroma Retail. People, I'm telling you, I got turned on to this product. My house has never smelled better. Their oils contain no volatile organic compounds such as pollens often found in unrefined essential oils that cause allergic reactions. They're formulated for optimum performance and mechanical diffusion machines and can be used in a variety of places like apartment lobbies, assisted living, bars, nightclubs, car dealerships, casinos, gyms, hotels. They have over 80 fragrances that can be found in resorts, places, mood collections, and seasonal. If you've ever wanted your place to smell like a floral shop or the Golden Nuggets coconut breeze smell or a luxury spa, go to the show notes or my website, beforethelightspod.com. Go to the sponsor page and click on the Aroma Retail logo so they let you know that I sent you, and use the code LIGHTS10. That's LIGHTS10 to get 10% off your product. That's Aroma Retail. Go to the show notes. Geno, will you talk about to my listeners how you were harassed by a wannabe mobster? I believe it was Erwin Gordon. Believe you were the baccarat floorman at the dunes at the time.
Well, there's a couple of stories. First one was Dominic. His name was Sam Manarite, M-A-N-I-R-E-T-T-I-T-E. And his son was a 21 dealer, and Sam was from Boston. He knew some of the old timers that were involved that came into the dunes, and he grabbed me one day and held me up against the wall of the coffee shop. He says, "I want you to get my son in the baccarat." And I said, "Sam, I have nothing to do with this. I couldn't do that for myself." And anyway, he was kind of a screwball. He was in a shootout on a car lot here. I think it was in the RJ. I think I talked about that. But I went to work in the baccarat like in 1968. No, 69. And I don't remember the shift I was on, but it might have been days. But Erwin Gordon was appointed baccarat boss. And he was Sid Wyman's one of his prime associates in the Dunes. These guys could do what they wanted to do because they had the backing of Sid Wyman. And George, basically, Duckworth had to kind of follow suit. There was some animosity between them all, but one day I'm dealing, and there was a cocktail waitress I was dating that was in the Dunes baccarat. And Irwin didn't know this, but, in those days, 69, we had a little longer hair than we do today, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, so he went and got a brush from the cocktail waitress. And I didn't even see him do it. I'm busy paying bets, and I was a dealer then. And he got the brush, and he came up to the back of me, and he started brushing my hair. He said, "Oh, look at this beauty." And he did this just the way I'm going to say it. Look at this beautiful hair. The Brooklyn accent, right? And I kind of got embarrassed, and and then he did it a couple. And I slowly, after I paid the bet, I marked the commission. I turned to him, and I said it to him very quietly. I don't think anybody else could hear me. I said, "You do that to me one more time, I'm going to knock you on your ass." And I went, "Oh my God, what did I just say?" He just pushed my button, and I knew I'm going to get fired over this. He laughed and walked away. Never said another word about it. But I think he liked the fact that I stood up for myself. I think he liked that. And he was always nice to me. I mean, a lot of guys didn't like him, but there he was. He was the boss. I'll never forget one of the first nights on his shift. We had a guy that was a George. That's a guy that tips big money,
Yep.
And versus a Tom who doesn't tip. And the guy is real, tipping us real good. Irwin walks behind us, and he hits me in the back like a nudge. He said, "What are you waiting for? You get your end, don't you?" And what he meant by that is hustle him. And it's okay to hustle. Go ahead. So that was that. So, but he was not the only boss that was in there. There was some great other guys. Dave Goldberg, who was Sid Wyman's friend from St. Louis as well, who was originally in the poker room, but then they put him in the baccarat, who was completely a great guy. I used to run with him, used to work out with him, played racquetball, and he was just a great guy. And he had a cousin by the name of Chucky Burns. And Chucky Burns would remind you, Tommy, of your uncle, like Uncle George or Uncle Chuck. Just laughable, nice little guy. You think he was an angel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, during the course of writing my book, I found out he was the one that hired the guy to put dynamite in Ash Resnick's car at Caesar's Palace. And so this was complicated because I know that Dave Goldberg was associated with Johnny Vitale and Anthony Giordano and probably a couple of other guys in Kansas City. So that opened my eyes. I said, "Oh my God, I had no idea." I didn't know that then. And so that was a story about Irwin Gordon and the baccarat.
Geno, you were terminated twice by the Dunes. The second time, you found out that you were secretly followed and your activities were being recorded by agents dressed as everyday people after applying for a non-restricted gaming license.
The first time. I left with permission of George Duckworth to go out to the Skyline Casino in Henderson, still there.
Right.
And a guy by the name of Frank Kish, a bookmaker, and his son operated it. And they got another guy by the name of Johnny Ligori. And they wanted to sell it. So I looked at the possibility of maybe buying into it. They were kind of interested, so they gave me permission to go out there. I went out there. The owners had some beefs. There was a secret partner no one knew about. I decided to go back to the Dunes, and George brought me back to the Dunes, put me in blackjack for a week and a half, and I went back into the baccarat. And then I worked there for, that was got to be in, I think that was like in 72, maybe, when I first left and then came back. So it had to be like around 75, 76. George calls me into the office and he says, "Geno," he points to the roof and he whispers and mouths the word Shenker. Shenker wants to get rid of you. But he didn't say it out loud. He mouthed it. And I said, why? What's the problem? I have nothing to hide or anything to be worried about. If you need me to take a polygraph test, I'd be more than happy to do so. He says, go back to work. We'll work. We'll think about this. So I went back to work for another week. And I want to tell you something. In the gambling business, if you did something wrong, they don't let you go back to the table for a week.
Agree.
But they just get rid of you. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that didn't happen. And so then about a week and a half later, he calls me into the office again. He says, I got to let you go. You want to resign? I says, no, I wouldn't get any, unemployment. I don't have any other income. And so I left, and I opened a small little business for a while. And then I found out there was an opportunity to buy into this place in Henderson. And I bought into it. As I'm getting my gaming license, it's taking a long time for a simple investigation. In those days, I paid him almost $4,000 in investigative fees, which today would be about, 4 times that, maybe, in present value of money. And I was wondering what's taking so long. So this one interview, this guy's investigator says, do you know this X person's name? I don't remember that name. I says, no, I don't know who that is. I do know of a guy by the name of Jim Reed, who was a player, and he was just a nice guy. He liked sports. He had an airplane. And he said, one time if I come down, we'll go for an airplane fight. I said, oh, that'd be great. So one time he called me. He said, I'll meet you at the Chateau Vegas, which was a local little dinery we used to go to. And we went in there, and we were just talking about sports and normal things. I mean, absolutely, completely normal conversation. And all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, he asked me this question: can you get me credit at the Dunes Hotel? That sent a red flag up to me. Why is he asking me that? He knows I can't do that. I can't issue credit on the table. Maybe a call bet or so, but I can't issue credit. And I kind of was worried about it, and I'm thinking there's something wrong, but maybe not. Maybe I'm overthinking it, and I went back to work. Well, I guess this guy, this is what I was told by the Gaming Control Board agent. And I can't access this file today. They will not let me look at my own file even.
Wow.
He said, that's the truth. That's terrible, actually. He said that this guy went to Shenker, and Shenker gave him money for him to tell him that I approached him, which I absolutely did not. Did absolutely never did anything wrong with this guy. I don't know what he was even talking about. So I don't know where that came from. It could have been from who knows. Mm-hmm. Shenker might have just wanted to get rid of me. I wasn't. I was on the old team still. I'm a loyal guy, and I didn't do anything. To make Shenker pissed off. But one more thing about this, I was told by one of the owners of the Dunes, Shenker could have been an informant. And he very well could have been the one that tipped the FBI off or tipped information off about Wyman's, Gordon's, and others. We don't know exactly who was involved in their bookmaking operation out of Regency Towers to get his license. We don't know. That's just a speculation on my part. So that was that, and I was followed. In fact, I even saw the agent in front of my entrance to my gated community when I lived there, and I looked at the guy and I said, "That guy is not normal." And that was probably one of the guys that was following me.
Speaking of the bookmaking operation at Regency Towers, I want to get to that, but first off, it was said that the Dunes had a super secret room for bookmaking. Was this true? And if so, where was it?
Well, I never was in the room, but they had I believe they had a place that they used to answer phone calls, and
who was involved in it?
Well, it's all documented. You had Wyman, you had Gordon. They indicted Maurice Dodson. I think it was Phil, a guy by the name of Vera, who was the lines maker, and he was just a great lines maker. He wasn't really an operator of the book, and they operated the book. But I think of something that they had for years and years and years. You know, in one weekend, the FBI discovered that they won $320,000 on one day therein. So it was a pretty successful operation. But I believe there was informants. I don't think the FBI figured it out. They either used surveillance of bug lines, or somebody actually came in and talked to them about it.
Do you know where the room was in the dunes?
It was one of the hotel rooms, I assume.
Okay.
It could have been off. It could have been off the second floor, third floor. I've never been to the room, and all they did was basically have a guy that would take bets.
Gotcha.
They used the long distance telephone probably to watch lines to do that with.
You had talked about the Regency Towers. November 7th, 1975, the FBI raided the Dunes cashier cage and searched 2 apartments in the Regency Towers and confiscated over $700,000 in bookmaking paraphernalia. This was from a 13-day wiretap. Do you have any suspicion that maybe a tip was given to them by Lefty Rosenthal?
I don't think it was Lefty Rosenthal. No, not at all.
You think it was Shenker, Morris Shenker, the lawyer to Jimmy Hoffa?
If it was anybody, it was someone who was associated, or maybe an ex-wife of Mike Cannon, or one of those guys that was indicted, or somebody. But another thing is, they did, that money was in the cashier's cage in the Dune. It wasn't in the Regency Towers. So they actually, there could have been someone in the cage that tipped them off. They could have had an inside agent as well. Because Wyman would come down. I remember one day he came down, and Sam Angel, the guy that used to sell jewelry, also a heavy poker player who won the World Series of Poker once, he let Sam Angel spread out at the back of the cage, open his cases up and put the jewelry for sale. And who knows where that came from. He was a great guy. But Wyman would say, "Hey, Sam, I want to show you the diamond I bought my girlfriend." And so Wyman would ask for his box. I saw this myself. And he got his box out, and he opened it up. And he said, "Sam, hold your hands out." And he started putting bundles of hundreds, 10,000 to a bundle, in Sam's hand. I mean, Sam's hands were completely overloaded with money. He had 2 hands holding all this money. And then Wyman would get the diamond out and said, "Look at this, Sam. How do you like this diamond?" He put it on his pinky ring, and he says, "You like that? Something in my eye?" You joke around. So people saw that they had money. So people assumed, and they probably had operators who were probably on a. I got to tell you this here. I know this for a fact that I don't think I put this in the book because I got the information later. But Shenker Senior, there's 2 Shenkers. There's Junior and Senior. Senior allegedly had an affair with one of the PBX operators, and I think there's a memo in the book, FBI memo, that talks about a conversation where they had the conversation with Mo Dalitz, Cupie Rich, and a few others verbatim. So there was somebody close in the dunes that was telling stories. Now, another possibility or theory that I have is that Shenker wanted that license, okay? He didn't like Irwin Gordon because Irwin Gordon didn't like him. He liked Wyman, but because he had to deal with him. But Wyman really didn't like Shenker. Duckworth really didn't like Shenker. They didn't like him. Cupie his father had passed away already. And no, he wasn't dead yet, but he was not working at the dunes. They didn't like Shenker. And for whatever reason, they had their reasons. It's a very good chance that Shenker might have said something to somebody one of his security guys that used to be a gaming control agent that worked at the dunes when I was there. Pass some information on to somebody that we think that they're bookmaking. One day, Shenker stopped me in the pit before I got fired. Not immediately, but within 2 months. He says in his Russian, accent, "Geno, you tell me, what's Irwin Gordon doing in the baccarat? What you tell me what's going on. I don't know anything about anything. And what am I going to say to him? I don't know anything about anything anyway. What they do is their business.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I looked at it. I do remember, though, Gordon was busy one day. We had a busy game, and we were losing money. I had to get a fill, and I walked up to the little pit stand where he was standing. He was writing some numbers down. And I said, Irwin, he said, can't you see I'm busy? So anyway, let's put it to you this way. It's a very good possibility, and the person who told me about him is two people, actually, that it very well could have been somebody laid that information on. Now, also you'll find there was a very famous gaming writer, Phil Hevener, who used to write for the Las Vegas Sun, who wrote a gaming column. It was the first guy in town to do something like that. And he wrote, what's happening here and what's happening there. It was quite interesting. He interviewed me one time about something entirely different years and years later, like in 2008 or 7 or something like that, about some business I had. And at the end of the interview, he says, Geno, you used to work the dunes, didn't you? I said, yeah, Phil. He says, you ever heard of Joseph Yablonsky? I says, yeah. He says, he tried to get me to do something to set an owner up, to try to sting him. I says, you're kidding me. He said, no. And he wouldn't have any part of it. He walked away from it. And Yablonsky, by the way, lived in the Regency Towers.
Geno, Hoffa was mentioned over the dunes and alleging Frank Fitzsimmons was skimming. In your opinion, do you believe that this had some of the downfall to Jimmy Hoffa?
Let's put it to you this way. Hoffa's hand-picked guy was Dorfman to handle the loans, right?
Alan Dorfman.
That was his hand-picked guy. And he basically threatened Shenker. You'll find that in the book as well. And they felt that they had something coming that Hoffa didn't pay them. And they had the money coming, and they tried to put it on Shenker. So it looks like there was some very, very interesting issues of Hoffa's loyalty to Shenker and so forth. And by the way, you'll see that Shenker was quoted when he's talking about how the Stardust was basically pulled from under him. He was trying to buy the Stardust with the Teamsters. And Durlactor went to the guy that owned it, that owned Recreon, and basically pulled the wool from under Shenker, the rug from under Shenker. And Shenker said in the book, you'll never hear Todd Durlactor's name paged in the Dunes Hotel. So that was Wyman's very close associate. So there's lots of going on there. That, but I do believe that Hoffa had a piece of the Dunes, no question about it.
Is it true also that Howard Hughes was trying to buy the Dunes, which did not go through, but his motive was behind a unsuccessful burglary of the Democratic chairman Lawrence O'Brien's safe, which that led to Watergate scandal?
There's an article that kind of indicates that. It was in the Wall Street Journal, I think. I noted that. When Howard Hughes wanted to move into the Dunes, so his advance man came there. I remember watching Mayhew walking around with Duckworth in the casino. Duckworth was showing him the new remodeling that they did. And Howard Hughes rented like one of the floors, or maybe even 2 floors, and had all of his phones installed. He never moved in there. And Cupie Rich, Charlie Rich, George's dad, was kind of like, we need these rooms for our high rollers. We don't want him in here, and they didn't let him move in. So that was his opportunity at that time.
What was your relationship with Johnny Hicks, who was played by James Woods in the movie Casino as Lester Diamond? And what do you know about real-life events between Johnny and Jerry Rosenthal?
I met Johnny as a kid breaking in downtown. He was working at the Horseshoe Club. He was very close to the Binions, and he was a friend of my immediate boss, Bucky Willard Howard. Bucky Howard, we called him. Bucky was a great guy, and so he came over to see Bucky, and Bucky introduced me to Johnny, and we became friends. And so I knew him, and I used to meet him at the golf course, the driving range, a couple of times, and so forth and so on. I used to see him when I was out once in a while, and in fact, one day Johnny knocked on my door at 2:00 in the morning. I lived in a little apartment complex it was a condominium called Sunrise Villas off of Eastern and Desert Inn. Johnny Hicks said, "Hey, I want to show you my dad's gun. This is the one that he had when he was partners with Lansky." And he brought his dad's pistol in. That's Marion Hicks, who owned the Thunderbird, who was Meyer Lansky's partner. Johnny was a good guy to me. A lot of guys didn't like him. A couple of guys I interviewed in the book didn't like him. Some of the ones I can't identify, but they might have been a pseudonym I gave them for the interview. They felt that he was a thief. I didn't know anything about his thievery as far as the chip cup that was exposed. And Johnny was over there with a guy by the name of Murphy. They went over to Mel Meyer's home, and they got into an argument. And Mel Myers pulled the gun and shot Murphy. Johnny got indicted for murder. He eventually beat the case. And then I remember the last time I saw John was about 4 days before he died. I was only like 26 or so, 27, and I went over to his house. He lived on the country club. His country club was just catty corner to Lefty Rosenthal's house. In fact, my kids used to play with my son Matthew. My former son Matthew passed away. Used to play with Lefty's son Stephen, I believe his name was. I think that's right. Anyway, I was at Hicks's house, and just a couple of friends were over, and BS and that sort of thing. And I left, and 4 days later, he was killed. And I was really afraid at the time to go to his funeral because I didn't know if anybody, saw me there or whatever. Who knows? I mean, I didn't know anything about anything. And his buddy who used to watch his place, Pete Griffin, who was a crap dealer at the Sahara, we've never seen him again. He took off and never came back. And that's one of the reasons I was afraid to go there. But John was nice to me. I got to say that. They killed him, and a lot of people think it was over an incident. That was a fight between Lefty and Johnny Hicks in the Flamingo Sky Room, called Big Al's Speakeasy. And I guess Johnny was there with some friends, and in comes Lefty with Jerry, who was Johnny's old girlfriend. And they got friendly, and I don't know if he went to dance with her or whatever. And Lefty got mad, and they got into a fist fight. Johnny was practically killing the guy. They had to break him off of him. And I believe that was the reason he was killed. That's my opinion. The movie was totally wrong the way they portrayed that.
Right.
They didn't beat him up in the car like that. That's not what happened.
Whether it was Lefty that killed him or ordered the hit, and maybe Spilotro took him out, somebody took him out.
It could have been Spilotro ordered it and somebody else did it. I think I put the names in the book there from a guy that was a famous writer in town here, John Smith. But yeah, I believe that Lefty ordered the hit. I do believe that. And they probably had another reason. They probably told him that he's the one that was behind this chip cup, and they were stealing out of the Stardust and a couple of other places. That could have been also one of the motives. But I believe it was Lefty was just pissed, and that's what he did.
What do you feel like was the vibe of the Dunes in general? Was it a feeling that the Dunes was mobbed up and being ran by the Dunes, or was it more that it was known that it was being ran and everybody else was just a family inside?
I believe this. The latter is probably accurate. I think everybody knew it. I think the gaming commission even knew it. I think they were all. The governor, he had to be in partnership with Riddle and Rich and all those guys. Governor Sawyer, he let them alone, and I believe they might have I even feel they might have blackmailed him for something. I don't know. But the Dunes was a wonderful place. People loved the restaurant. They had the best of everything. I mean, the Sky Room upstairs, the Sultan's Table, the magic violins in the Sultan's Table, the Dome of the Sea with Kippy Lou and the harp. The place was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
The golf course. I mean, a full championship golf course. And great swimming area. They had shows. And if the customers who were repeat customers didn't want to see the same Casino de Paris, they would send them to other shows, and play, buy them a ticket for the show. But it was a good feeling. It was a great vibe. I couldn't wait to get to work. That's how much fun it was. I think I was a smart ass when I was younger, and I regret that. I don't mean a smart ass. I guess I was a loyal person to the owners, and I might have been a little flippant, but I guess you grow up with that stuff, and you grow out of it. But I certainly loved the employees, and I loved the places. Nothing I wouldn't do. I mean, nothing I wouldn't do for any of them.
When the Dunes was imploded on October 27th, 1993, how many stories you think went down with those walls?
Oh, I wrote a chapter at the end, I think, that told a lot of it right there. I think many stories we'll never know, because you'll never know the real stuff. One day, just for instance, I told this in the book. This was unbelievable. There was a very famous poker player named Stu Younger. Okay, the kid. He was raised in the New York slosh house, which was a place where they gambled with playing cards. They had card games, gin, claviage, and so forth. You name it, they've had the game. He played Sid Wyman gin rummy. Sid Wyman had 20 people behind him, on his side, on the rail, and next to him. And the kid had one person behind him. He beat Wyman out of $75,000 cash. I was there. I actually saw this. We were right, on our breaks, we'd go over and watch. And then the kid took the $75,000, went to the crap table, and lost it all back. It's an exciting place. Exciting place.
The book, Las Vegas Dunes Hotel, The Mob, The Connections, The Stories. Get your hands on it. Will be out in early September. Stay tuned to my show notes. I will have a link in there where you can purchase the book. Geno, thanks for your time, man, and being on Before the Lights. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Tommy.
If you'd like to contact me, send me an email, beforethelightspod@gmail.com. That's beforethelightspod@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram @BeforeTheLightsPodcast. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. And until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.